Okay, welcome. Hopefully, I believe this is going to be the last one of our Mashiach shiurim, which is why we'll end it on a high note with some fascinating, wild stories that are kind of as much legend as they are story and fact. But we'll see that they have some early sources, and I'm guessing that no one here has heard of any of them before, but you're going to be fascinated by them, I guarantee. So where is the source for these personalities? So we're gonna tell stories about individuals that attempted to bring Mashiach. That was their goal. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was not the first one to say we want Mashiach now. There were individuals before that made actual practical attempts to bring Mashiach, and obviously where we're holding today, they all failed. So the question is why they failed and what was their story. So two of these personalities are actually not really mentioned anywhere in the Sfarim, the Poskim. You don't really find a lot of mention of these two personalities. Now, if a person wanted to bring Mashiach and he was that great, you'd think he'd be mentioned. So the first place we find him mentioned is by Rav Chaim Vital in his Sefer Sharei Kedusha. And Chaim Vital is discussing the fact that after we lost the ashes of the Paraduma, so we no longer have what's called mechatas. In order to purify yourself from spiritual impurity caused by contact with the dead body, you had to get sprinkled with the mechatas, the water that was mixed with the ashes of the paraduma, the red heifer. That's what had to take place. So from the day that we lost those ashes, and we've never found them again, there are only a very limited number of paradumas that were ever burnt and turned into the mechatas. So from then on, we've never had the ability to purify ourselves from spiritual impurity caused by a dead body. That's a fact. So nobody is pure. Nobody is actually tahor. There's levels of kedusha. So people still go to the mikveh to get rid of some forms of tumah, but avi avos tumah, the most intense form of impurity, is impurity that is imparted by a dead body. And everyone at some point in their life has probably come into contact with a dead body or gone to a cemetery or been in the same building as a dead body. If you've been in a hospital, so then you're spiritually impure. So at some point in a person's life, we assume that everyone has this spiritual contamination. So at that point, when we lost the paraduma, so the ability to reach a level near nevuah was lost. Even after nevuah was taken out of the world, there was still a very high level of kedusha that a person could reach to access spiritual realms and spiritual knowledge. And once we could not remove that impurity from us, so clearly we have less access to the spiritual worlds. And from then on, the only access we have to the spiritual worlds, writes Rav Chaim Vital, is through the lower world of Asiya, which is the world that we're in now. And the world that we're in now has a physical world and a spiritual counterpart. But the spiritual counterpart is on a very low level. Unlike the higher worlds, which are very lofty and very pure and very pristine, the lower spiritual world of Asiya, which is the spiritual counterpart to our world, is mixed with good and evil, very much the way our world is mixed with good and evil. So there's demons there, there's impure spirits, pure spirits, there's holy divine names, there's unholy divine names, and that is really what we call practical kabbalah. Practical kabbalah, when people would do what some would call magic, but it was kabbalah, they'd use divine names. What was practical kabbalah? So they knew names of different angels and demons, and they could make the angels and demons take oaths and serve their masters, so to speak, by making them take these oaths. So that was practical kabbalah. Was they had these sfarim, they had these books that would teach you these divine names and these meditations to access these divine creatures, and you would force them to do certain things, or you would impart these divine spirits onto inanimate material. You make a golem, all these different things people have heard of. So that's called practical kabbalah. Now, right, Rav Chaim Vital, Zehu Sod Inyan Kabbalah Masi. This is the secret of practical Kabbalah, that it's contained in the lower world, which is why it would look like black magic, almost exactly the same. So he paskins that it is forbidden to use practical Kabbalah, because if you use it, even if you're trying to use the pure divine names, so because we're dealing with the lowest spiritual world that has admixtures of good and evil, by definition, if you're going to use those pure names, they're also mixed with evil. And therefore that evil will cling to a person who's trying to use that practical Kabbalah. And he's thinking he's going to purify his soul, and he ends up making it disgusting and dirtied. And even that which he does perceive, if he perceives certain spiritual information, it's going to be mixed with falsehood, with sheker, with lies. And specifically because we don't have this ashes of the red heifer to purify a person, so that impurity that's even clinging to him naturally is going to attract more impurity, and he's going to end up falling much more than he will be elevating. And therefore he says, someone who wants to guard his soul will stay away from practical kabbalah. That's your warning, everybody. Stay away. Okay? And besides the fact that you're going to become tameh and impure because of these impure spirits, you're also going to be punished for making these angels and demons take oaths, which is not pleasant for them, and you'll be punished with Gehenna. V'af gam ba'olam hazeh hakabbalah beyadenu ki ya'ani o hu o zaro o yichla b'chalaim hu o zaro o yishtamed hu o zaro. And also, not only will it damage a person in the next world, but even in this world, he will become impoverished, either him or his offspring. He'll become sick, either him or his offspring, or he will be destroyed, either him or his offspring. So it's very, very, very dangerous for a person. This is Rav Chaim Vital, the prime student of the Arizal, and all the books of the Arizal are written by Rav Chaim Vital, so he is pretty much the authority on Kabbalah, and he writes this in Sha'arei Kedusha. Now this is where our story begins. So at the very end of this section, he writes, V'kach raya me Rabbi Yosef del Arena, and the proof is from Rabbi Yosef del Arena, Rabbi Shlomo Moljo, and Rabbi Shlomo Moljo, shenishtamshu beKabbalah ma'asit, that they used practical Kabbalah, v'ne'evdu min ha'olam, and they were destroyed from this world. Okay, so has anyone ever heard of Rabbi Yosef del Arena or Rabbi Shlomo Moljo? That's interesting if you heard of him. Probably heard of him from the Mishnah Berurah here that we gave. But most people have not heard of either of these two names. So what was the story that he's referring to? Well, who was Rabbi Yosef del Arena and who was Rabbi Shlomo Moljo? And we'll even do the final story if we have time will be the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But three attempts at bringing Mashiach. Okay, so I'm going to do some reading inside and some I'll speak it outside because it's a very complicated, fascinating story. But Rabbi Yosef del Arena lived from 1418 to 1472. So historical context, that's about 100 years before the Arizal and Rabbi Yosef Karo. So this is a long, long time ago. And it was right before the Inquisition, right? But he wasn't in Spain at the time. We'll see what took place. So Rabbi Yosef del Arena was a Kabbalist, a master Kabbalist. He was one of the greatest tzaddikim in his generation when he began. And he had 5 students that were with him, 5 primary students that would do anything that he asked. They would give their life for him. And one day, he told his students that we are going to bring the Mashiach. We're going to bring the redemption. Why? For the sake of Hashem. He said, I can't stand living in a world of Chil Hashem anymore, where God's glory and the Jewish people are living in the dust. At that time, the Jewish people were being oppressed, and God's glory was definitely absent from the world. So he said, we're going to bring Mashiach not for our sake, but for the sake of God. And his students said, whatever you tell us, Rebbe, that is exactly what we'll do. So he said, we're going to go out to the fields, and we're going to purify ourselves for 3 days. We're going to fast day and night for 3 days, and we're going to make an oath. And our oath is that we will not return home until we bring the redemption, and every Jew will settle on his plot of land in Eretz Yisrael. That was the oath that they all took together. Okay, so they go out to the field, and he brings with him besamim, spices. He brings with him a sofer pen, a scribe's pen, and some parchment, and they go to Meron. That's their first stop on their journey. So they're in Israel at the time, and they go to Meron in the north of Israel, and they daven by the kever Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now at night, in a dream, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai comes to Rabbi Yosef del Arena, and he asks him, why are you getting yourself into such a difficult task which you will not be able to carry out? So Rabbi Yosef del Arena answered him that Hashem knows his intentions are pure, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gave him a bracha. So that was his first stop. He got a bracha from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in a dream, and he decided that the next day they would go to Tiberia. So they went to Tiberia, and they went to the Kinneret, and they were dunking in the Kinneret and using it as a mikveh. And they did 26 consecutive dunks in the mikveh, and the entire time they were concentrating on the divine name of Hashem that corresponds to the number 26, Yud Kei Vav Kei. So they were concentrating on this name, And they did this for 3 consecutive days again, and they fasted again for 3 consecutive days. They did not eat anything, day or night. That's a lot of fasting. Okay. When evening was approaching, so they closed their eyes and they began to daven Mariv. And they said Hashem's holy name of 42 letters, which is a divine name that they used to concentrate and to conjure Eliyahu Hanavi. So Eliyahu Hanavi appeared to all of them. And Yosef del Arena said to Eliyahu Hanavi, I'm zealous to honor the great Hashem, blessed be He. Show me how to subdue the Satan and to strengthen the holiness and the Sitra of Kedusha. How do I take away the side of Tumah in the world, strengthen Kedusha, and defeat the Satan? Because he said that was necessary to bring Mashiach. So Eliyahu Hanavi answered him, know this, what you are planning to do is very difficult and you will not succeed. The klipot of the sins and the transgressions are very strong and you will not be able to subdue the Satan. You must increase your Kedusha holiness and continue fasting and dunking in the mikveh. Otherwise, you will fail and the Satan will damage and harm you. Know that your intentions are welcome if you succeed. But my advice to you is to stop right now because you will not be able to overpower the Sitra Achra. So Rabbi Yosef del Arena said, please, my master, do not discourage me. I took an oath and I'll not return home until I raise the holy divine spirit from the dust. So when Eliyahu Hanavi heard this, he said, if you'd like to do so, then here's my advice. He said, you have to go out into a desolate area that has not been inhabited, and you have to stay there for 21 days. And for those 21 days, you have to fast all day. You'll be able to eat at night, but they fasted all day for 21 days. And every day, they immersed in the mikveh 21 times. Keneged the Shem Hashem Ekya. 21 times they were in the mikveh. So he went with his Talmidim, and they went out for these 21 days. They dunked in the mikveh 21 times. And Eliyahu Hanavi told them that if you do this, so then there will be an angel that will be revealed to you that is the angel that he is responsible for not allowing the Samach Mem, the Satan, into the places of Kedusha. And he will have the information that you seek about how to subdue the Satan. And if you do this, you will conjure up this angel. But if you're not pure and holy, so then the angel will destroy you. Okay. So they do this for 21 days. And eventually they do these tefillahs and they do these kavanas of the 42-letter name of Hashem. And this angel, Sandalphon, appears to them. And Sandalphon comes with his holy chariots and his fire. And when he speaks to Rabbi Yosef del Arena, so Rabbi Yosef del Arena is incapacitated on the floor. All of Talmidim can't move their body at all. And Sandalphon says, what is it that you want, worms that you are? Who gave you the audacity to shake the upper and lower worlds? Have self-respect and return home, unless we burn you with our breath. So Rabbi Yosef del Arena said, I do this for the sake of Hashem. I'm here to remove wickedness from the earth. And you know that my heart is pure. So Sandalphon touched him with his hand, and Rabbi Yosef del Arena was able to stand up and speak to him. And he asked him if this angel could teach him where the Samach Mem, the Satan, is, and how to defeat him. That's the information that he asks. So he told him, this angel Sandalphon, that I do not have that information that you seek. He said the power of the Samach Mem is so intense and so strong that he's almost impossible to defeat. The only angels that know how to defeat him are Achtiel and Matatron. These are 2 very high angels. Matatron is the prince of all angels. He's the angel that's the master of the world. In fact, backstory to Matatron, he was actually Chanoch. If you look in Sefer Bereshit, so Chanoch was a biblical character that it says at the age of 350, he was taken by Hashem. He didn't die. It doesn't say anywhere that he died. So the Midrashim say that he was actually taken into the higher worlds because he was so holy and pure, and he was actually converted into the angel Matatron. That's who Chanoch became. So this was the angel that had the information that Rabbi Yosef del Arena seeked. And he was told that this is the only way that you will be able to find out where the Satan is found and how to defeat him. So he asked Sandalphon to tell him. He says, hear my words and Hashem be with you. Continue for 40 days the immersion, fast, and purification of thoughts. Do not stray from holy thoughts for a split second. Decrease the portion of food till your body will need very little to survive. Continue smelling spices because this is the most vital to give strength to the neshama. After 40 days, pronounce the holy name that contains 72 letters with great kavanah. When you do this, you will be able to call upon the angel Achtiel and Matatron, the prince of angels. Okay, so he was given these instructions, and it's more of the story, but him and his Talmidim, essentially, they do these instructions. They go through the motions for all of these 40 consecutive days, and eventually they marked a circle on the ground and entered inside it while linking hands together and formed a circle. They announced the great name of Hashem of the 72 letters and called upon the angel Achtiel and Matatron with great kavanah. The earth shook, and these two angels appeared to them. They all were locking hands, and they all fell unconscious on the ground. They couldn't move their body, and their soul had been so removed from their body by the awe of seeing these angels that they were all near death. Finally, Metatron reaches out, and he touches Rabbi Yosef del Arena. Rabbi Yosef del Arena gets up, and he asks him how he can find the Satan and how he can defeat him. There is a whole back and forth. Metatron says, you're not going to succeed, you shouldn't go forward. He said, I took an oath that I'm doing this for the sake of Hashem. They agree that his intentions are pure, and they say, okay, we're going to tell you how to defeat him. So they told him that when you approach the Samach Mem, which is the name for this angel, which is, we'll say it one time, you're not supposed to say his name, but we'll say it one time, is Samael. That's the name of the angel of the Satan. Samach Mem is what they call him in the Sfarim. When you approach the Samach Mem, you'll find him at Har Seir. So the pasuk says that at the end of time, God will judge the Yetzer Hara, which is the Samach Mem, which is the Satan, and he's going to judge him at Har Seir. So that's the place where Esav's power lies, Har Seir, that was given to Esav, and that's where you find the Samach Mem, the Satan. So he told them that when you go find him, you'll have to pass through three barriers on your way to find this Samach Mem. And he's going to give him the tools with which he will have to pass these three barriers. One is going to be a mountain that reaches to the heavens, that's covered with snow, and it'll seem impossible to pass. And he tells him how he can actually pass through this mountain by using certain divine names, and the mountain will vanish. Then he'll reach an ocean with waves that reach as high as the heavens, and he gave him a special pasuk to say the ocean would dry up. And then he would reach an iron wall that it says was 8 centimeters thick, that's what it says here. And he would have to take a knife that had inscribed on it a specific pasuk, and he'd be able to cut through the wall, and they'd be able to enter through this entrance and finally make it into the center of Har Seir. Okay, wild story. So that's exactly what happened. So he gets to the mountain, he says these incantations and these names of Hashem, and he gets through. He gets to the ocean, he says the incantation, it dries up, and he breaks through the wall, he cuts through, him and his Talmidim go through. His last Talmud, it says, didn't make it through fast enough, and the wall closed on his leg, and he was able to take the knife again and cut it open again, and he actually pulled his Talmud through, and they all made it to the other side. Then the angel told them that you were going to see black dogs, a whole horde of black dogs that are going to be coming towards you. He told them a specific pasuk to say, and then they would all vanish. And it's exactly what happened. All these black dogs came out towards him. He said this pasuk, and they vanished. Black dogs, just so you know, this isn't an isolated story. Rav Chaim Vital, who we just quoted in the very beginning, Shari Kedusha, Chaim Vital was the student of the Arizal. So the Arizal is buried in Sfas, right? And that's where Rav Chaim Vital lived. Where would you expect Rav Chaim Vital to be buried? Probably in Sfas, next to his Rebbe and all the other tzaddikim that were in Sfas. Where was he buried? So in Damascus, in Syria. So what was he doing in Damascus? So now we're on the topic of wild stories. So I'll do a very short tangent to why he's in Damascus. There was a church of idolatry that was in Damascus, and whenever the Jews would take out a body to a Jewish burial, they would have the buyer that would be carrying them in the casket. And along the way, when they had to pass through this church of idolatry to get to the Jewish cemetery, when they would pass this church of idolatry, they'd feel suddenly the casket became very light, and they would open it up and the body was gone. And this happened over and over again, that the bodies of these Jews were being taken away, they didn't understand, through some sort of black magic, and these bodies were missing. So they wrote to Rav Chaim Vital. This is like historically why he's in, this is like the story of how he got to Damascus. So they write to Rav Chaim Vital, and they say, because he's the greatest kabbalist of the era, and they describe what's happening, and they said, we need you to come and to save us from these forces of evil that are dominating the community. So he actually traveled to Damascus because of their request, and he saw this church, and he saw that this was a tremendous force of evil in the world, in Damascus, specifically this church. And it's a long story short, but he said a whole bunch of divine names and tikkunim, and there was a whole back and forth story. But eventually, he broke the tumah of this church, and what happened? There were hundreds of black dogs that were shooting out of this place. All these black dogs came running out, and then the church collapsed, and they convinced him to stay in Damascus as their Rebbe. So he stayed there as their Rav. And that's how Rav Chaim Vital ended up being buried in Damascus by becoming the rabbi of this community, because he was taken there to take away, to exorcise the body snatchers of this tumah. And that's where Chaim Vital is buried in Damascus. So you see that these black dogs have a place in Kabbalah, that they represent the forces of impurity and idolatry and tumah in the world. And therefore, that's why it's not shocking when you read other stories about the Arizal and about the Chaim Vital. So this is kind of expected. So Rabbi Yosef del Arena continued on, and the angel Metatron told him that he would find the Samach Mem and his wife, which again we'll say the full name once, is Lilith, is the name. So we say Lil, as you say, we'll say Lil and the Samach Mem. And this angel told him he would find them in the form of two giant black dogs. And he told him that he gave him these plates, these metal plates that had the name of Hashem on them. And he said, if you take these metal plates with the name of Hashem on them and you place them on the dogs and tie a rope around them, then you will have defeated them. And then you will take them to Har Seir. And there Hashem will judge the Samach Mem and his evil wife, his demonic wife, and he will shech them, and then Mashiach will come, the great shofar will blow, and that'll be the end of time. That's what he was told, Rabbi Yosef del Arena. So he succeeded. He had the plates, he put them on these two dogs, and he captured them, he had them in ropes. However, Metatron and Achtiel, the angels, they warned Rabbi Yosef del Arena that you cannot give him anything. He's going to ask for food, he's going to ask for anything he asks for you, you cannot give him anything. Do not give the Samach Mem anything. So he said, okay, easy instructions. So it was him and his 5 Talmidim. They had captured the Samach Mem and Lil, and they were going to Har Seir. The Samach Mem on the way started begging to him, please give us food or we will not survive the journey. And he said, no, absolutely not. I will not give you any food. And he was so happy with himself that he defeated the Samach Mem. He was about to bring Mashiach, that he took out his incense from his pocket, which he brought with him, and which he had constantly been using whenever the angels had come and he had lost all his strength. He had returned his strength by smelling this incense, which had given strength back to his neshama. So he smelled the incense, and the Samach Mem asked him, if you don't give me any food, at least give me to smell the incense. So he said, okay. And he gave the Samach Mem to smell the incense, and the Samach Mem smelled it, and the incense burnt up on fire. A spark came out of his mouth of this dog. Well, it wasn't a dog. He said, after he put the chains on him, I forgot one part, it turned into the form of a human. The Samach Mem and the Lil has a human form. It turned into the form of a human. He gave them to smell. Once they smelled it, a spark came out of the mouth of the Samach Mem and it burnt up the incense. And it was as if he had offered, as if Yosef del Arena had offered idolatry to the Satan. And at that point, the Satan regained his strength and he took off the ropes and he started attacking Rabbi Yosef del Arena and his 5 Talmidim. 2 of the Talmidim died immediately. 2 went insane. And the last was left with Rabbi Yosef del Arena. So what happened to him? Here's the sad ending. So after this, Yosef del Arena went to the city. So first he buried his 2 dead students. The 2 demons that had possessed the other students that had lost their minds both died. Also, they both died. So he was left with him and his 1 student. That 1 student was also incapacitated and suffered from terrible, terrible sickness. And he writes, after this, Yosef went to the city of Sidon where he settled. His ways turned very evil. There had been a bas kol that came out that after he had given the Satan this besamim, this incense, so a bas kol came out and said, you are wicked, woe to Rabbi Yosef, he's lost his portion in this world and the next, and he's been given over to the Satan. That's a bas kol that came out. So he went to the city of Sidon where he settled. His ways turned very evil. He saw that he did not succeed, and since he heard from the divine voice that he had lost this world and the world to come, he made a covenant with the malicious Lilith and handed himself to her, and she became his wife. He polluted every way possible and used holy names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do evil. Every night he would conjure spirits and devils to fetch him his heart's desire. He continued his evil ways and had more women than possible until he even had the wife of the king of Greece. He had her brought to him every night, and in the morning he would give her orders to return. One day the queen told her husband, every night I have a dream that I'm in a certain place and with a certain man, and I find myself in the morning in our bed. When the king heard this, he summoned the magicians and placed them on guard at the queen's home. That night the demons came at the order of Yosef to take the queen, and the guards noticed them at once. They forced the demons to tell them why they had come there nightly to take the queen. And the demons answered that they were ordered by Yosef from the city of Sidon. When the king heard this, he sent a certain minister to the city of Sidon with gifts to the lord of Sidon, asking that Joseph be sent to him alive immediately. When Yosef realized that his deeds were known to the king, even before the minister had arrived, he threw himself into the ocean and died. And that was the end of his life. As for me, and this is who was writing the story, the 5th student, This is the fifth student was the one who wrote the story. I was left alone and sick on my sickbed all my life. There is no remedy for my ailment, nor do I have any reprieve from the demons. I have written this tale for a memorial. So that was this Yosef del Arena that Rav Chaim Vital was writing in Shari Kedusha, who used practical kabbalah, and he said this was the lesson that if you use this practical kabbalah, so then since in this world it's connected to the forces of Tumah, so the forces of Tumah will ultimately overpower the person. And that was our first story of almost bringing Mashiach. That was the first attempt to bring Mashiach, which failed, and that was in the year, again, it was in the 1400s, Okay, so that was a pretty wild story. So that was already, again, that was mentioned by Rav Chaim Vital, already, right, he was the one who brought the source of Yosef del Arena. He didn't bring the story, but that's a story that's brought in the different Sfarim that speak about this. A wild, wild story, and very, very sad. Okay, our next attempted bringing a Mashiach is an even wilder story, and this one is not only documented in Torah Sfarim, we do have it mentioned in different Sfarim, but it's also mentioned in the secular Sfarim as well, which is why it's even more fascinating. You can go on Wikipedia and you can read about these two historical figures that are very mysterious but fascinating. And I think I'll give you some other background that's going to make it even more fascinating. And these are David Rovani, if anyone's ever heard of him, and Shlomo Moljo. So Shlomo Moljo is actually quoted one time in Mishnah Berurah, which is interesting enough, because we're going to see at the very end of his life, it's quite controversial whether we view Shlomo Moljo in a positive light or in a negative light, as a false Messiah or as a righteous person that died al Kiddush Hashem. It's a machlokes in the later Achronim, but he's brought in the Mishnah Berurah, quoting the Magen Avraham, as to how a person should tie his tzitzis. And he writes that a person should tie, that the wraps around his tzitzis should correspond to the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. So it should be 10, 5, 6, 5. That's how he says the tie tzitzis. So Sfaradim, Nusach, Edut Mizrach, Ezra Levi, he ties his tzitzis like that. That's how they have their tzitzis. And that's based on this Magen Avraham, quoting Shlomo Moljo. So if the Mishnah Berurah brought his name, clearly we can assume that the Mishnah Berurah felt that he was in the camp of the righteous that died al Kiddush Hashem. Furthermore, his name is mentioned in one other place, is the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. So he has a sefer Magid Meisharim. And the Magid Meisharim is actually a conversation that he had with a Magid. A Magid was a divine messenger sent from heaven, an angel of some sort, that would speak to different tzaddikim, and they would teach them Torah, and the tzaddikim could ask them questions, and they would answer the questions. So in his sefer Magid Meisharim, he asks the Magid that he wants to die the death of Rav Shlomo Moljo. That's his dream. Because Shlomo Moljo, we'll see, died at the stake. He was burned alive al Kiddush Hashem. So he says that he wishes to die that death. So clearly, the Beis Yosef, who met Rav Shlomo Moljo, as we'll see in Turkey, so he felt that Rav Shlomo Moljo was a tzaddik, and he wished to die al Kiddush Hashem like Rav Shlomo Moljo. Okay, so the story starts with David Rovani. Okay, who's David Rovani? David Rovani is fascinating. He's described as a short, almost midget, like a 5 foot tall. He looked African American, Afghani, and he wore Oriental clothing. And he suddenly appeared on the scene in Europe in the year 1499. He appeared in Europe, and he goes to the Jewish communities, and he claims that he is from the 10 lost tribes. And he's from a kingdom of Jews that live in Afghanistan, where the 10 lost tribes were taken. His brother is the king of this kingdom. He's the Secretary of State. And he was sent on a mission to make a pact with the European Christian kings to lead a pilgrimage to Israel and to wrestle Israel from the hands of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabs who were controlling Israel at the time, and to return it to the hands of the Jews. That's his mission. And he has documents that prove it, and he has documents from the kingdom. He says his kingdom is 300,000 men, and they have an army that's waiting to come and conquer the land of Israel as long as it makes pacts, military pacts, with the Christian kingdoms in Europe. And that's his mission that he sent on. So he actually found very wealthy Jews that supported him and funded his mission once he got to Europe, and he made his way to Rome. That was his first stop. Okay, what does he do in Rome? And this is all documented in the secular sources, so you can read this on Wikipedia, and it's fascinating what he did. Okay, so he goes to Rome, and he meets Pope Clement VII. That was the Pope at the time. And he's actually granted an audience, and he rides into Rome on a white horse. This little tiny Afghani man on a white horse. He rides in and he has a banner that he says is from his kingdom, and he has an audience with the Pope. And he explains to the Pope where he's from, how he has this whole kingdom of Jews from the lost 10 tribes, and he lives by the Sambation, which is the river that we say that cannot be crossed, or the 10 tribes on the other side of the river. During the week, that river is shooting up fire and brimstone, or different stones, and you can't cross it on Shabbos, so you're able to cross it because the stones stop, but you're not allowed to cross on Shabbos if you're a religious Jew, so nobody can ever get to the other side. The Akdamos, famous story of a rabbi that was able to cross to Pikuach Nefesh, but he couldn't come back. So that's where this tribe lives. And he says, in the tribe that lives there as well, they're called the Bnei Moshe. They're the offspring of Moshe. Okay, and that's where he's from. Now, side point, and this is why it's so fascinating personally for me, because I was once in a shir by a Rav from Lakewood named Rabbi Pollack. Rabbi Pollack, he actually is an expert in mikvahs. He built the mikvah in West Hollywood. He's also an expert in the lost tribes, the 10 lost tribes. And he studied it vastly. He knows every bit of information on these tribes. He's looked through military documents of the troops in Afghanistan and what they saw there. He has pictures. One day I want to bring him to shul to have him give a presentation. One of the most fascinating stories you'll ever hear. So he has basically proven, he knows without a doubt, that the 10 tribes are in Afghanistan, in an autonomous region, which means it's a mountainous region that no government really has any authority over, because it's too hard to actually gain authority over a region like that. These are called autonomous regions. And there are these tribes. One is the Pashtun, which many have heard of, the Pashtun, which claim that they're Bnei Yisrael. This is an Afghan tribe that is a sect of the Taliban, but not the militant Taliban of Osama bin Laden, but a different sect of that Taliban. And they're evidently tremendous warriors, great warriors. I mean, the American government couldn't defeat them. That's because he was saying that there's unbelievable warriors. He says they are giant, some of them are giants, and he has pictures of these Afghan men that look Jewish. This is the wildest thing you'll see, that are about 7'5". He has a regular person standing next to him. They look like NBA players. And he has pictures of these Afghan men. And he says that they claim that they're Jewish from Bnei Israel. But he says if you met them, you'd never know they're Jewish, because remember, the 10 tribes were expelled from Israel before the Anshe Knesset HaGadola, before the Gemara, right? There's no Derabanans, right? All of the Derabanans, which is 80% of the Judaism we live today, is all based on the religion that was developed through the Gemara and through the Torah Shabbal Peh that we developed in the Gemara, and all the decrees that were made in subsequent generations. So none of that was there when they were living their Judaism. They pretty much had sacrifices and mitzvahs d'oraisa, and everything else looked very, very different. And they were exiled at that time in history. So if you met them, you wouldn't think that they're Jewish in the way they were Jewish. They have similarities. They have kosher shchita. They have a few things, but they don't have any derabanan. So it's a very different type of Jew that exists by the 10 tribes. And he said he's from so this Rabbi Pollack tells us that there's a specific tribe within the Pashtun called the Bnei Muzeh. What's Bnei Muzeh? Bnei Moshe. They're the Bnei Moshe. They have red hair and they have payas. He says they have long locks on the sides of their heads, and they're known as the best warriors in the whole tribe of the Pashtun. He's Bnei Muzeh. And he has a crazy story about this Bnei Muzeh, that he actually got declassified documents from the U.S. Army that said there was a platoon. You can find it on YouTube and see the video about it. They just speak about it. A platoon of 10 Marines that were dispatched to a part of the autonomous region, some of the mountains over there, that all went missing. They sent another platoon after them, and they found all the uniforms and bones outside of a cave that looked like it was inhabited by someone. As they approached the cave, they said something, and this is what they write in the actual documents, and he showed us the documents. Something came out of the cave that they thought was an elephant. It was giant, and if one of the commanders was actually standing on the other side of the cave, and this person whatever came out of the cave didn't see him, and they shot him and killed him before he could attack this platoon. And he said this is what he writes in the thing, it was a 12-foot tall man with red side locks on the side of his head. So he says this is wild. This is what he has, but he has a document. So he actually said he called the soldiers that were part of the platoon that had their names listed there, and he spoke to one of them. That's what Rabbi Pollack says. He actually spoke to one of them. And this is the story that they said that it happened when they were there. And they were told there was an order that was sent out that they were never allowed to go to this region again. No American soldiers were to be sent there. There was no point in being there in terms of their mission in Afghanistan, but they basically learned this was a dangerous region and they stayed out. And these are where the lost 10 tribes are supposed to be settled. Now he writes here, this I thought was fascinating, on Wikipedia, and he didn't know all these things I just told you. I mean, Wikipedia doesn't know about, Rabbi Pollack's research and all this stuff. This is just a page about David Rovani. So they write that according to those that say that David Rovani was from Afghanistan, so he says, Daoud Rubani is the name of a folk hero of the Pashtun tribes. And the similarity of the names is striking. So when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, I remember Rabbi Pollack's shir about the Pashtun being from the 10 lost tribes. And then I saw this and I said, oh my gosh, so this David Rovani who said he's from the 10 tribes and said he's from the Sambatya, which they say is in Afghanistan. And then there happens to be in the Pashtun tribe a folk hero called Daoud Rubani in their tribe. That's who they speak about, this individual. So this is David Rovani. So that's what David Rovani was. So he goes to Rome and he meets with Pope Clement VII, and the Pope is actually taken aback by him. He's convinced and he likes this person. And he says, I can't get involved right now, but I want to give you a letter of recommendation to go and to speak to the King of Portugal, who's my brother-in-law, who's King John of Portugal. So David Rovani goes to King John of Portugal, and Portugal at the time is undergoing an inquisition, which means they were finding all the Jewish Moranos and conversos, the Jews that had been forced to convert, and they were trying to find out which ones were still practicing Yiddishkeit and torturing them either to death or until they confessed. And that's what's happening at the time. So this Jew rides up, right? And he's a proud Jew, and he says he's Jewish. And he rides up on his white horse, and he goes to meet John, the King of Portugal. And because he has the letter from the Pope, so the king takes him seriously, and he gives him an honorable position in the court at that time. And he speaks with him, and he promises that he's going to give him, what was it? I think it was 8 ships and 4,000 cannons. And he said that he was actually going to pause the Inquisition that was persecuting the Jews at the time until he finished his negotiations with this David Rovani. Okay, now we get to Shlomo Moljo. Okay, so listen to this. The story gets wilder. In the court of King John of Portugal is a Jewish wunderkind, a super genius Jew that at a very young age he grew up in a converso family, which means he grew up totally not religious. In a converso family, so they weren't even keeping Judaism secretly. This guy knew nothing about his Judaism. His name was Diego Pires. So Diego Pires, at the age of 22, became the scribe of the king, and he was a genius in astronomy and mathematics, and he rose very, very quickly. He was the young superstar of the king's court. And he sees this David Rovani come into the court, and this guy says he's Jewish and he's from the 10 tribes. And this Diego Pires always knew that he was Jewish, so he tells David Rovani, teach me about Judaism. So David Rovani, who's on his mission to essentially attempt to bring Mashiach, says, I'm sorry, but I don't want to get in trouble. If I start there's an inquisition happening right now. For me to publicly teach you Torah, and you're a member of the king's court, I'm going to get killed. So every day this Diego Pires would beg him, and he says, I have a burning desire in my soul. I know I'm Jewish and I know I want to connect to Judaism, I want to connect to God. And he said that that the Christianity feels impure to him and he doesn't want to have any part in it. And David Rovani keeps pushing him away until one day Diego Pires says, that's it, I'm going to circumcise myself. So he actually gives himself a bris milah. And there's 2 versions of the story. One actually says that when he woke up from giving himself a bris milah, he knew the whole Torah. He knew the whole Torah. Okay, that's one version of the story. The other version of the story is equally as amazing. Let me get the other version. So there is a Kabbalist that was actually the Rebbe of Rav Shlomo Alkabetz and the Beis Yosef, named the Maharitatz. Maharitatz was a Rishon or an early Achron. He was a Kabbalist. He was also Talmudist. He was a posek. The Maharitatz is quoted in different Sfarim. So Rav Shlomo Moljo, not only did either he knew all this Torah when he woke up, which they're not mutually exclusive, both stories can be true, but he was certainly a Talmud of the Maharitatz, and he went to go learn in Turkey under the Maharitatz, and there he learned Kabbalah from the Maharitatz, at the same time as Shlomo Alkabetz, and it said that there he met the Beis Yosef as well. That's how the Beis Yosef, in his Ma'akim Yesharim, said that Yosef Karo said, I wish to die the death of Shlomo Moljo, because that's where he had met him. So he was certainly the Talmud of the Maharitatz. Yes, this Diego Pires changed his name to Shlomo Moljo, which, if you know what it comes, Shlomo HaMelech, right? A very Messianic name. So Shlomo Moljo, and he became this Kabbalist that was everyone that mentions him in the early writings around the times of Beis Yosef that met him was extremely impressed with him and said he knew all of Kabbalah, he knew all of Torah. And this is Shlomo Moljo. So Shlomo Moljo joins David Rovani. First they split up for a little bit. He goes and learns in the yeshiva of the Maritats. They come back together and they go back to their mission and they go back to the Pope. And eventually they travel from the Pope to Germany, where they meet with King Charles, the King of Germany. And King Charles is not so happy about their claims. And in fact, he finds out that Shlomo Moljo went to try to get the Pope to convert to Judaism. Shlomo Moljo asked the Pope to convert. Okay, evidently that didn't go well for him. He lost the support of the Pope to a certain extent. He goes to this King Charles in Germany, and he tries again to have him form this alliance with the kingdom of the Jews of the 10 tribes in Afghanistan to conquer Israel back from the Ottomans. And at that time, the Inquisition was not paused, and they take Shlomo Moljo and David Rovani, and they try them for practicing Judaism when it's obviously forbidden, and they give Shlomo Moljo the punishment of being burnt at the stake. So Shlomo Moljo was actually given a choice when he was actually being burnt at the stake. They asked him at the age of 31, they asked him if he would convert, and these were his last words. He says, regarding this, that I lived with this religion, Christianity, my heart is bitter and troubled. Now do as is good in your eyes, and let my soul return to its father's house like in its youth. And with that, so Shlomo Moljo was burnt on the stake, and he died the death of a martyr. And that was the end of Shlomo Moljo. David Rovani was put into a prison, and nobody really knows where he went after or whether he died, but most accounts say that he died in prison, and that was an attempt to bring Mashiach, that they said that they were attempting to bring Mashiach. And along the way, there was one other part that Shlomo Moljo wrote to the Pope that there would be a flood in the Vatican and to evacuate, and the Pope listened, and there was actually a flood that killed many people. He told the King of Portugal that there would be an earthquake, and there was an earthquake, and he predicted it. And at the time, it's written in different Sfarim that he was one of the most famous names in the entire Jewish world, and even in the non-Jewish world. He became this massive figure, and they actually have, this is very cool, they have his flag. He had a flag that he would ride around with that said Maccabi, right? Mi chamochev ba'elim Hashem. So he had this Maccabi flag. This is his flag. They have it in a museum. And this is a signature. They actually have his writings. He wrote a sefer, and his signature has his flag, and it has all these Kabbalistic different symbols in it as well. So this is Shlomo Moljo and David Rovani, who again was attempt number 2, at least that we know of, to bring Mashiach, to make a pact with the Pope and convert him to Judaism. Can you imagine like what's happening there? And they also failed. Okay. So now, very quickly, we'll do the last story. The last story is the one that is the most recent, and this one is a story about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. It's a story that's told by Dr. Aryeh Morgenstern, who is a fellow at Machon Shalem in Yerushalayim, and he's a historian who specialized in the settlement of Israel, and he worked in New York for the Jewish Agency of Israel. Okay, so he's in New York, and it was Simchas Torah at Chabad. Now, Simchas Torah, remember, is the second day of Yom Tov for us, but for him, he's Israeli, it was already after Yom Tov, so he wasn't really taking part in the festivities. So what was happening at the time? This was in 1973. Simchas Torah of 1973 was the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was still going on. It started in Yom Kippur, and it was still going into Shmini Atzeres Simchas Torah. So it was during the Yom Kippur War, but at that point, the beginning of the Yom Kippur War was a disaster. The Jews were attacked, and they were not prepared whatsoever, and over 1,000 Jews died in that war. And eventually the tides turned, and then the Jews went on the offensive, and they were pushing into Egypt, and they were pushing into Syria. Okay, so they're pushing into Egypt and Syria, and Dr. Aryeh Morgenstern brings his friend Dr. Shlomo Levine, who's in charge of the religious affairs at the Israeli consulate in New York, and they both go to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay. So imagine the Hakafos are about to start. There's thousands of Hasidim in 770. They walk in, and the Rebbe parts the crowd and tells them to come straight up to the front. They come up in front of the bima, and everyone's waiting for hakavos. But now suddenly they said a silence fell on the whole crowd, and everyone's trying to hear the conversation that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is having with these two Israeli diplomats. How long do they speak up there right before hakavos start? A full hour. He speaks to them for an hour, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe told them that the tides have turned, and Hashem is giving them an eis ratzon, and that he says the Jewish army needs to push all the way into Damascus and needs to conquer Damascus from Syria. He says they need to ignore the battlefront in Egypt, not to push forward anymore. They're not going to have any strategic gains there anyway. But he said the north is where the power of the Arabs comes from, and you have to continue to push into the north. And he brings all these psukim, and he brings all these proofs that it'll save Jewish lives, you'll get back Jewish war prisoners, and you have to continue to push into Damascus. So the diplomats tell him, but you should know the Soviets are threatening to get involved if we don't pull back immediately and have a ceasefire. So we can't go any further. He said, don't worry, the Soviets are worried that the Americans are going to get involved, and you can push back, you can push forward, they're bluffing, they're not going to get involved. So they tell him, what do you want us to do? So he said, I want you to go and to call the war cabinet, right? I want you to call the defense ministry and to tell them, and this is a crazy line, but he quotes this. You can watch the video of him saying this. He said, tell them that the Lubavitcher Rebbe gives the order to conquer Damascus. That's it. The Lubavitcher Rebbe gives the order to conquer Damascus. And he told them that all of the power of Yishmael, of the Arab nations, spiritually comes from that place. And if you break that place, he said politically, he said back then Damascus was like, they looked at it like the power hub of the Arabs, even though Israel thought it was Egypt, but he said it was more Damascus than Syria. And he said you have to conquer Damascus. Interestingly enough, going back to our story of Chaim Vital and the source of Tumah in Damascus, and that's where Chaim Vital is buried, so it could have something to do with this special city. And he told them, tell them to go give the order that the Lubavitcher Rebbe says to conquer Damascus. So these two Israeli diplomats went home, and this doctor is now telling the rest of the story. He says, so I called up my friends that were in the cabinet at the time, and they were actually having the meeting at that time, what they were going to do, their military strategy. Were they going to pull back and listen to the Western countries that were telling them to have a ceasefire, or were they going to push forward? And he tells them, I just had an hour-long conversation with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He tells his friend to get pulled out of the meeting. They pull him out of the meeting. He's on the phone with him. He tells him the whole conversation with the Rebbe, and he says, tell them that the Rebbe gives the order to conquer Damascus. So the guy goes back into the meeting, and he says that an hour later he called back, and the person came out of the meeting and said Moshe Dayan was petrified of the Soviets getting involved, and he gave the order to pull back, and we're not going to go forward anymore. So they pulled back, and then, that's the end of the video. So that was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's attempt to, which this is 1973, right? So it's not so long ago. And you can watch the video of this individual who had the conversation with the Rebbe telling the story. And this is another wild story where the Rebbe felt that the time for Mashiach had arrived. So you see, first of all, that throughout history, there has been attempts to bring Mashiach. And at the end of the story, actually, of Rabbi Yosef del Arena, it writes that no one can force the coming of Mashiach. Only Hashem will bring him when the time comes. Our job is to learn Torah, do mitzvahs, do chesed, do our part, and do tshuva. Tshuva is really what brings Mashiach. He said, we do tshuva, and then Mashiach will arrive when it's time for him to arrive. But any forcing the issue and trying to push things when they're not meant to be pushed, again, it's not necessarily something that's wrong, but it always results in disaster for the person that tries to push the issue. As you see from our first two stories, both of those individuals were destroyed in this world, and according to some sources, in the next world as well. So they tried to force the issue, and it wasn't time. So there's a lot of danger in trying to push the envelope when it comes to Mashiach if it's not the right time, because the forces of evil are there. They're trying to stop it from happening, and for one individual to take it upon himself to push it is very dangerous. But nevertheless, how do we do it? With Torah mitzvahs. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe, after his attempt in 1973, he took a different approach, and he said, let's do kiruv. Right? Let's spread mitzvahs to the rest of the Jewish people. Let's try to effect as much tshuva as possible, and that's how we're going to bring Mashiach. So today, that's the mahalach. The mahalach is the more Jewish souls that you bring back, and the more mitzvahs that you generate in Klal Yisrael, your own mitzvahs and the mitzvahs of others, and the more tshuva that you can create yourself or through others. So that's how we bring Mashiach. That's the goal of bringing Mashiach. So we be zocheh that the next attempt that is made should be successful. It should be the Mashiach emes, not these somewhat false messiahs that existed throughout history. We should have the real Mashiach, and we should be zocheh to see his light. B'mher b'yameinu. Amen.
Amen.